Ever since a little over a month ago, Gege Tommy decided to tell us that there's only 5 chapters left in JJK, we as a fan base have kind of been scrambling. See, because Sukuna was still alive when it was revealed there was only 5 chapters left in the story. And you, MHA's ending, which some had the audacity to call Rush, had a 7-chapter epilogue. And thus, as we are in the midst of this 3.5-ish chapter epilogue, people are left with a lot of questions. What is Kusakabe gonna do as the new head of the new Shadow-style school? Are the Kamo and Gojo clans truly going to go to war? What's gonna happen with the Zenin clan? Will another clan rise up to replace the Zenin clan? What is Gakuganji doing as the head of the Jujutsu Society? Who inherited Kenjaku's will? Better yet, who's with Takaba? Are we going to see a time skip? Are we going to see Team Gojo graduate? Are we going to see Team Gojo visit Gojo's grave? See, because while Chapter 270 did seem pretty epilogue-y and very dedicated to closing the story out, as we checked in with effectively every single person who was left alive after the Culling Games and saw what they were up to and what they were trying to accomplish now in a post-Sukuna world, but both Chapter 269 and 270, which are really the only real epilogue chapters we've gotten from JJK, opened up as many new plot lines as they did close old ones. See, Chapter 269 was as odd a manga chapter as I've ever read in my entire life. A manga chapter that supposedly came out as the 3rd to last manga chapter of one of the most popular mangas on Earth, which accomplished a grand total of nothing. It was a 10-page recap on a 60-chapter fight, where all the characters involved in said fight talked about how the fight could have concluded separately, just for them to come to the realization that nope, it had to go exactly how it went down. Followed up by 10 pages of borderline incomprehensible garbage yapping around the new Shadow-style school. Something that undoubtedly some JJK fans were curious about, but most could care less about. And yet amongst all of this garbage, something interesting was offered. And that was the pondered thought amongst the conversation of the new Shadow-style school and its new leader Kusakabe, which was, what's gonna happen with the 3 royal clans of the Jujutsu Society? Are the Kamo and the Gojo going to go to war? Is the new Shadow-style school gonna raise up as the replacement for the Zenin? What will be the motivations of this war? How will it pan out now that the Gojo and Kamo clans have lost both of their respective heads? Or will we ever see this war pan out? Or will it just be implied that there's tensions amongst the royal clans, and that's something we're gonna have to deal with? In Chapter 270, while better than Chapter 269, fell into a lot of the same tropes. See, because while Chapter 270 operated much more like an epilogue than Chapter 269, the chapter did end with Team Gojo realizing that they were going to have to hunt down an awakened sorcerer from the Culling Games who's, for some reason, using Jujutsu to harass a couple. And thus Chapter 271, which is supposed to be the last chapter of JJK, mind you, is not only going to have to conclude the storyline of Team Gojo hunting down some awakened sorcerer who's for some reason harassing a woman in a relationship with a man by making her boyfriend's eyes seem really big, but it's also going to have to attempt to do all the things that I listed earlier, like show a time skip, or Team Gojo's graduation from Jujutsu Academy, or Team Gojo visiting Gojo's shrine. You know, epilogue stuff. And thus, the more I think about it, the more I feel as though we will be getting a sequel to this story. And today, I want to explore what that sequel could look like, how it could happen, who the main villains would be, and how they would fall into those villain roles. Because I believe there is still a lot, and I mean a lot, of meat on the bone of JJK. Which is why today we're talking to Jujutsu Kaisen Confirmed. But before we get to confirming anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you want to see me try to bring real-life challenges to the anime world, go ahead and follow the brand new channel I created with Stephen He, Chris Barnett, and Danny Mata called Anime IRL. Or if you just want to hear me talk anime and manga, go ahead and follow my anime podcast, Talkers Anonymous, where me and Danny Mata break down everything that happened in anime and manga this week. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. So, like we've already established, there's a couple of key hints in the last 2 chapters that have made it feel as though JJK isn't going anywhere. Whether that's the Kamo and the Gojo clan preparing for war, America kidnapping sorcerers from the Culling Games, or the fact that somewhere out there, one of the awakened sorcerers from the Culling Game is for some reason harassing couples. Now, any 3 of these storylines would be enough to continue Jujutsu Kaisen on. But when you consider the fact that all 3 of these storylines have been brought up in the last 2 chapters alone, and it starts to feel like Gege is trying to leave some crumbs for us to follow. So let's follow those crumbs. First, let's talk about the Gojo and Kamo clans. They are in 2 very unique but very similar situations. See, it's obviously very well known that the Gojo clan is currently without a head. Gojo Satoru died in combat against Sukuna, and while his body and his curse technique was temporarily revived so that Yuta could use him as a flesh mech and accomplish effectively nothing. So far as we currently know, Gojo is dead, which means that the Gojo clan that he was the head of no longer has their head. Now, this is bad for the Gojo clan, but not detrimental. See, prior to Gojo's death, the Gojo clan was absolutely the strongest clan out of all of the royal clans of the Jujutsu Society. After all, the incredibly rare mix of somebody being born with both of the Gojo clan's curse techniques only happens once every couple hundred years. And thus, throughout the entirety of the Gojo clan's existence, there's probably been less than 5 Gojos. People born with both the Six Eyes and the Limitless. However, the loss of Gojo doesn't mean that the Gojo clan is lost. Yes, did they lose their strongest piece? Absolutely. But they're still a royal clan, filled with those who can either use only the Limitless or only the Six Eyes. And while the Limitless without the Six Eyes is basically useless, those born with the Six Eyes are still incredibly powerful. In any way you look at it, regardless of the Gojo clan situation, they're in a better situation than the Zenin clan. See, because while technically Megumi is a Zenin, he took his mother's name and wasn't raised in the Zenin clan, so he is a Fushiguro. And therefore that means that the only remaining Zenin clan member on Earth is Maki, because when her and Mai were beat within an inch of their life and thrown into a dark hole to die in, when Mai died, Maki gained heavily restriction and killed everybody in the Zenin clan, including Naoya, twice. But does this mean that the only legitimate threat to the Gojo clan is the Kamo clan? I don't really know. See, the status of the Kamo clan is actually one of the biggest lingering questions in JJK. Kamo clan is considered the core of the conservative faction at the heart of Jujutsu Society, and therefore they're the most set in their ways out of any of the big 3 clans. However, prior to the execution of the Jujutsu Society higher-ups, the Kamo clan were undoubtedly, out of all of the big 3 clans, the closest to the higher-ups. The Kamo clan values tradition and blood lineage more than any of the other clans. They're old-fashioned. However, all of that kind of changed, or maybe didn't, after the Shibuya incident. Because after the Shibuya incident, Kenjaku takes over the Kamo clan. And this makes sense because the greatest stain on the Kamo clan's legacy is Noritoshi Kamo, aka Kenjaku, aka the creator of the Cursed Womb paintings, aka the most evil sorcerer in history. But this means in the time between the Shibuya incident and Kenjaku's death, the entire Kamo clan was operating under the puppet leadership of Kenjaku. Therefore, when Noritoshi Kamo, the new one, comes home after the Shibuya incident looking for the head of the Kamo clan to get into contact with Gakuganji so that he could galvanize the higher-ups to rescind the assassination order on Yuji and try to get Gojo broken out of the Blue Eye prison realm. It's so simple. When Noritoshi comes home, the only other Kamo he finds is an elderly Kamo by the name of Shino, and Kenjaku very heavily implies that he killed the head of the Kamo clan so that he could take their seat. And thus the Kamo clan is in a very similar situation to the Gojo clan, where in a post-Sukuna world, they could have either been wiped out by Kenjaku, who wanted to control the Kamo clan, or at the very least, lost their head. But unlike the Gojo clan, the Kamo clan does have a clear choice for a successor, and that would be Noritoshi Kamo, who grew up being the blight of his family because his father, who was the head of the family, had a child with his mistress, and that was Noritoshi Kamo. Now, technically, when Kenjaku was in control, Noritoshi Kamo was excommunicated from the clan and removed from the line of succession, so I'm actually not entirely sure if Noritoshi Kamo will be the next head of the Kamo clan. However, it's lingering questions like this that most likely will not be answered in Chapter 271. And as the Kamo clan ties its roots back to the main antagonist of this story, wrapping up what's going on with the Kamo clan is pretty important, especially considering the fact that it's multiple times been told to us how important they are in the political sphere of the Jujutsu Society. And when you take all that in consideration, next to the fact that we've learned next to nothing about how the Jujutsu Society is going to function now in a post-higher-ups, post-Sukuna world, wrapping up the Kamo clan plotline is a really good idea. Add this into the fact that for some reason, Chapter 269 needed to establish to us that the Zenin clan no longer exists, like we didn't know that, but rather the new Shadow Style school, which is now controlled by Kusakabe, seems to be becoming one of the greatest forces of Jujutsu power in the entirety of this newfound civilization, and we could see with this now giant power vacuum at the top of the Jujutsu Society, a three-way struggle for these 3 powerhouses, the Kamo, the Gojo, and the new Shadow Style school, to try and wrestle above each other to grab hold of this power that's sitting at the top of Gakuganji's head. See, because while Gakuganji has always been referred to as the most trustable of the higher-ups, I doubt the Jujutsu Society is going to continue to function woman with just one very elderly man in charge. Once again, these are lingering questions that most likely will not be answered in 271. But what about lingering questions that will be answered in chapter 271? Well, in accordance with that, I'll introduce you to the second plot line that could possibly introduce a sequel. And that was the plot line that was introduced just a couple of days ago in chapter 270, which is supposedly Team Gojo's final mission. See, because rather interestingly, about 16 pages into what was supposed to be the second to last chapter of this entire manga, for some reason we decided to introduce what seems like ostensibly a side quest. A side quest that revolves around a woman being cursed to see her boyfriend with a grotesque face. And it was on the last page of chapter 270 that Megami gave us a hint to try and deduce early who this sorcerer who possibly could have placed this curse on this woman could be. As Megami hypothesized, as the level of cursed energy being placed on this woman was nothing to go beyond bad vibes, most likely the person who placed this curse on this woman was a surviving, awakened type culling game player. And while at first you might be thinking, oh, well, there's only one of those that's still alive, no, there's actually a couple. Not until you go through the entire list of culling game players do you realize just how far away from the merger we were. When I tell you, we weren't even close. Because I have a list right here of all of the culling game members' names. I also had to look up if they were still alive, how they died, if they were reincarnated or awakened type, and if they did fit the role of alive and awakened, if they would be the kind of person to put a curse on a woman to make her see her boyfriend kind of funky. So let's quickly go over all the participants of the culling game and what they're up to right now. Let's start off with everybody's favorite electric femboy, Kashimo, who's dead. Kashimo decided to pull out all the stakes in his battle against Sukuna just to get off-screened. Also, he was a reincarnated type, so he doesn't fit the mantle. After him, we have Hana, who's also a reincarnated type and is still alive, trying to marry Megami. After Hana, we have Higuruma, who, yes, is alive, and yes, is an awakened type culling game sorcerer, but is currently dodging trials for the people that he murdered and is being worked to the bone by the Jujutsu Society. Tie that into the fact that his curse technique wouldn't be able to make a woman see her boyfriend all funky, and the fact that he simply wouldn't do that, and even though he fits the bill, he doesn't fit the bill. But speaking of people who are still alive and awakened type, Rin Amai, Yuji's childhood friend, is still alive and an awakened type. However, we saw Rin in chapter 270, and all Rin's up to nowadays is apologizing to the kids that he used to bully. I seriously doubt the guy whose last line in the manga was, "I just want to be decent," is going around hexing women. After Rin, we got Hanyu. You remember Hanyu, right? The girl whose hair turned into a jet that got defeated by a rock? Well, she was an awakened type, and she may still be alive. We never see her die. We actually never see her again. Period. Yuji knocks out her boyfriend, Propellerhead, who then gets filled with bullets by American soldiers down the line, and we're going to talk about American soldiers here in a little bit. Yeah. We never see her again. So technically, it could be her if somehow she's using her hair-based jet propulsion system to curse women into seeing their boyfriends funny. Listen, I'm gonna say it. Not everybody from the culling games was a winner. After Hanyu, we got her boyfriend, Haba, who's killed by the American government. He was an awakened type, but he's dead now. We got Yorozu, who was a reincarnated type. She died because Sukuna killed her. Reggie Star was a reincarnated type. He died because Megami killed him. But while we're talking about Reggie Star, we should talk about Remy, who actually somewhat interestingly fits the bill of what we might be talking about here. See, Remy, whose curse technique that she awoke to was scorpion tail hair. There's a lot of hair-based techniques, and like only in the culling games too. But Remy, who was dating-ish Reggie, is the one who led Megami into the trap that was the battle against Reggie Star. Now, she's not only an awoken sorcerer, but also gets kidnapped by the American military. And rather interestingly, we did get a fair amount of exposition about who Remy was as a character. See, Remy's whole gambit is that she charms men. She was a shallow girl who needed the validation of men to feel as though she was accomplishing anything. She had heard her whole life that men were vipers, and yet she charmed men to do things like pay her bills, clean up after her, and so much more. However, because of this, she ended up with men who didn't really care about her, like Reggie Star. Now, rather interestingly, this backstory plays rather well into our current cursing situation. Now, a lot of you who are big Remy stans might be saying, but Nick, wait, hold up. Remy's curse technique was Scorpion Tail, and all it did was like kind of hurt the people it bit. You'd be right. That is how it worked. However, we also need to remember that she was kidnapped, and that the person being cursed is a girlfriend in a relationship who now perceives her boyfriend as this monstrous entity, almost as if somebody targeted her to try and make her feel repulsion towards her significant other. Now, this would be a rather interesting plot development for the likes of Remy. Remy, who spent her entire life either using the men that she was with or being used by them, goes on some vigilante-esque arc where she's trying to stop women from being with men who may try to use them. Maybe Remy knows something about this boyfriend that the girlfriend doesn't. But you're probably asking to yourself, okay, but then how is she accomplishing that with her curse technique, which is Scorpion Tail? Well, Remy is one of, if not the only, curse technique user from the Culling games who is abducted by the American military. And therefore, as the American military is specifically trying to abduct Jujutsu sorcerers so that they can experiment on them, trying to figure out the energy source that is cursed energy, the experimentation could have augmented her curse technique or curse energy to the point where she would either be able to willingly place curses on people, like the woman that she cursed, or cursed energy became so prevalent on account of what the American military did to her after capturing her that simply by coming into contact with it, one becomes cursed. But the best follow-up question to all of this is, okay, how'd she get back to Japan if she was kidnapped by America? And the answer there could lie with Haba. See, Haba, who was an incredibly weak Jujutsu sorcerer being knocked out in one punch by Yuji, took an entire American military platoon to take out, as he survived bullets, grenades, and tasers. If hypothetically Remy was to be put through intensive experiments that probed and prodded at her and raised her curse energy level, maybe purposely, she could very easily turn into a curse technique user who would be stronger than Haba, and therefore she would be able to escape America. She also could now operate as a sleeper agent of sorts, being augmented by America and placed back in Japan in order to see what she does with this newfound power. We can't say, though we can probably deduce that the motivations of America in JJK are inherently kind of evil. I mean, they always have been. I think Gege's got something against us. I mean, would we kidnap Jujutsu sorcerers if they existed in real life? Yeah! Absolutely. But you don't have to be so mean about it, Gege. However, while we're talking about Remy, Remy also introduced the third and final plotline that could be expanded upon in a sequel. As Maki established in Chapter 270, that because of the expanded rules of the Culling game, it was going to become necessary to get back the Culling game's players that were stolen by the American military. And thus, there could absolutely be an entire arc where Maki and Team Gojo have to fly over to America to try and steal back Japanese sorcerers, as there's a fair possibility that the person who's cursing people in Tokyo is not Remy, and that Remy is just being experimented on by American doctors in some mountain in Colorado. And thus, when diplomacy fails, as it inevitably will, it'll be up to Jujutsu sorcerers from Japan to go save their own kind. And as Megumi was heavily involved in Remy realizing that the way that she was living her life was not appropriate and not sustainable, it makes sense that Team Gojo would be the people sent. But anyways, moving forward, talking about the rest of the Culling game members here, Iori is also dead. He gets killed by Kenjaku, who decapitates him, which is foreshadowing to Kenjaku getting decapitated. There's also Chizuru, who's dead. Bruv, who's dead. Ryu, who's dead and dies at the hands of Sukuna, but it did take Sukuna 2 tries, so good job, Ryu. Now, there's also Takoko, who is a reincarnated sorcerer, but is also alive. Yeah, the lady that Yuta got the space warp blanket move from, still alive. Now, she lost her arm, and Rika ate it, which is why Yuta's able to use that technique. But a reincarnated sorcerer from 1,000 years ago, who was a captain of the Sun, Stars, and Moon team, or something like that, is still alive, just running around with one arm. And yet, we lose Ryu. Take Takoko. After her, there's Charles, who is an awakened type and is still alive and kind of fits the mold of somebody who would do this. See, obviously, we saw Charles in Chapter 270, and Charles is working on his one-shot to submit to publishers to try and get his big break in manga. However, he says something interesting while he's feverishly writing his chapter, and that is, I'm a manga artist whose art sucks. Now, rather interestingly, the eyes of the boyfriend, at least from the perception of the girlfriend, are compared to that of an old anime in Chapter 270. Now, Charles, as a manga artist who's bad at drawing, does kind of fit the bill of somebody who would give a boyfriend bad old anime eyes as a look, but that's not how G Warstaff works. And therefore, while maybe Charles fits the bill as somebody who would do that in their own story, it's kind of hard to find a way in which he would actually accomplish that in the real world. And last but not least, we have Hagane and Roku Jushi, the two reincarnated sorcerers who Maki was talking to in Chapter 270. And while the both of them are still alive and and running around and exercising cursed spirits, they are reincarnated, not awakened. And so, in actuality, that only leaves one sorcerer from the culling games who fits this bill to a T. A sorcerer who's not only awakened, but alive and has the power to curse a woman to see her boyfriend with weird googly eyes like this. And that person would be none other than Takaba. Now, we already touched on the topic of Takaba being the villain of Jujutsu Kaisen in our Chapter 270 breakdown video. Go into why and how he could be fleshed out as a villain, or even why his involvement in Chapter 271 could lead to the continuation of the story. See, the beauty of Takaba is that it's been established that so long as he thinks something is funny, it will happen. And the more confidence he has as a comedian, the stronger his reality warping ability gets. Now, I would reckon that after the battle against Kenjaku, that Takaba has the most confidence he's ever had as a comedian. See, well, obviously Takaba goes through an internal struggle in the battle against Kenjaku where he's realizing he may not be funny. He overcomes that struggle and eventually forces Kenjaku into being his comedic duo, to the point where him and Kenjaku are performing live in front of thousands of adoring fans, doing what they both love most: comedy. And we can see over the course of this battle that Takaba's reality warping abilities are as strong as one could ever imagine they would ever be able to be, as Takaba was nonchalantly forcing location swaps, like when he made him and Kenjaku play around in an ocean of Fanta. All this is to say is that there's really nothing that's outside of the scope of what Takaba could accomplish if he wanted to right now, and reviving somebody is absolutely within the scope of what he would be able to accomplish. If Takaba can turn an entire environment from an ocean of Fanta to a live music hall filled with thousands of people who are waiting to watch him and Kenjaku do comedy, I'd like to reckon that if he thought Kenjaku coming back to life would be funny, he'd have the ability to bring Kenjaku back to life. And considering the fact that he would find Kenjaku coming back to life funny, because then Kenjaku could be his comedy duo and they would be successful, this is not only something that could happen, but probably something that should happen. But how would this lead to the continuation of the story, Nick, you ask? It appears as though in Chapter 270, even if Kenjaku is still alive, he's just existing as Takaba's comedy duo. He doesn't seem to be scheming anything up. He's not trying to initiate the merger. He's just getting yakiniku with Takaba. And honestly, you'd be right. And also, that would fall within the scope of Takaba's powers. See, Takaba didn't necessarily understand Kenjaku. At least he didn't understand what Kenjaku was trying to accomplish. Takaba simply bumped into Kenjaku and then forced him into a series of somewhat fortunate events for the both of them. They were friends by the end of their battle. However, their battle wasn't even a battle, at least not to Takaba. I mean, Kenjaku knew it was a battle, but Takaba didn't. In fact, at the end of their battle, Takaba was talking about how he didn't want it to end. And this is further backed up by the fact that the second that Yuta cuts off Kenjaku's head, he tells him about how Takaba would never kill. And thus, once again, Takaba wasn't really trying to kill Kenjaku. And thus, if hypothetically Takaba were to bring Kenjaku back to life, it would probably be in the vision of how Takaba would want Kenjaku to be, which was the Kenjaku that Takaba saw during their battle. Going forward with this ideology makes sense when you consider the fact that both Takaba and Kenjaku were dressed exactly the same in this chapter, and thus Kenjaku is kind of just a comedic mirror to Takaba. But how does that lead to the continuation of the story? Well, there's no short of a million ways that this situation between Takaba and Kenjaku could go wrong. On top of that, Takaba could just as easily, in Chapter 271, look at us and say, wait, hold up, I'm just now becoming a famous comedian, and now you're ending the story? No. I mean, he is a reality warper. He could have the ability in Chapter 271 to go, you know, it'd be really funny if this story kept going and it was about me. And thus we can get an entire arc as the Jujutsu Society crumbles at the fact that there's a reality warper who doesn't know he's warping reality, get too confident about his comedic abilities. And when you consider that side by side with the fact that there are sorcerers from Japan currently rotting inside of American laboratories and a brewing war between three megaforces in the Jujutsu Society in Japan, and I really just can't see a way that Chapter 271 closes out this story in any way that's even remotely satisfying for any reader of this story. But then again, that might be exactly what Gege is trying to accomplish. Reintroducing Kenjaku possibly as Takaba's comedy duo could simply be a troll. He could just go, I don't know, it could be Kenjaku, or he could have just found somebody who looks like Kenjaku for the rest of time. But for the life of me, Chapter 269, to me, screams that there's gonna be a sequel. See, because Chapter 269 wasn't a troll, it wasn't an epilogue, it was nothing. At least it was nothing without the existence of the continuation of that plotline. And I just simply cannot believe that an author who created this entire universe, one of the most beloved mangas of all time, would pitch a stinker that bad 3 chapters from the end of the story. So maybe it's copium because I'd like to continue doing manga reviews of this story, or maybe I'm actually onto something. What do you guys think? Do you believe we'll see a Jujutsu Kaisen? Tell me in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. If you'll excuse me, I have several ads due by the end of this month that I haven't filmed yet.